Good morning, it's Pastor Doug, and we are in the Gospel of Mark hearing the good news. And the good news is something that's everyone agrees on, whether they're believers or not believers, whether they're critics or they're strident followers. Everyone believes that Jesus was arrested, crucified, and put to death. And we're going to be looking at that crucial truth of Jesus on the cross. Picking up in Mark, we're in the 15th chapter, looking at verse 16. The soldiers took him away into the place, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to acclaim, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right, one on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And he was numbered with transgressors." Those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ha, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him were also insulting him. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Behold, he's calling out for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it him to drink, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion, who was standing right in front of him, saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Less, and Jose, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister him, and there were many other women who came up to him in Jerusalem. Jesus's final hours. It is difficult to read these passages. It's the Easter story and the passion of the sacrificial lamb who came to take away the sins of the world. It is his blood on the cross that sets men free. And when we see it portrayed in movies, sometimes it's so gruesome that we turn our eyes from it. There are medical doctors who over the years have put together reports describing Jesus's death from a medical perspective, and it's horrific. The endurance of what he went through, the pain and the agony, the suffering. We can only begin to glimpse it with these words that paint a picture for us of Jesus doing exactly as he had prophesied, doing what he had come to do, doing the very thing that he had told his Father in the garden, if there's any other way, but not my will, let yours be done. This was God's will. The soldiers took him in to the palace, the praetorium, that room of judgment. And they called together the whole cohort, that the whole army. Now, not everyone, but enough to represent the Romans who were there. He would be handed over to the Gentiles, as he told his disciples on the way to Jerusalem, and this is when it's taking place. And they did as expected. They dehumanized Jesus. They mocked him. They dress him up in purple. They take thorns and they wind them together to make a strophanos, a crown that they jam down onto his heads. We've seen the pictures of those artists who try to imagine what that would look like for us. The love mixed with pain that Jesus was going through, suffering for these people in the sin that they didn't even understand or know or comprehend what they were doing. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews," but there was no worship in those words. "Hail, King of the Jews," but there's no recognition of his lordship. It is all mockery. And while we can blame the Roman soldiers for being crass, being mocking, how many people look to Jesus and with the same mock in their life call him Lord and hail him King of the Jews, but they have no more belief than these soldiers, no more desire to honor Jesus than these soldiers. But of course, we are told in other scriptures later on that if Jesus be lifted up, all men would be drawn to him. And that's what we hear taking place as they mock him and they call him Lord and they beat him. His head with a reed. Now, this word for reed is the word for a cane. So think like a cane pole. A rod that's thick, that's unyielding, that can be used to beat someone and cause great pain and harm. And they were mocking him and they were beating him, and they then take that down, the purple off from him, and they put his own garments back on him, and they led him out to crucify him. He doesn't make it far. We know the story of Jesus going down what's called the Via Dolorosa, the way. And so as he's going down the road, he's so beaten because of the flogging, because of the way that they have just physically tore him down, the loss of blood. And he can't go on anymore. He can't pull the cross anymore. And so the soldiers want to get him there. They want to get Jesus to the place of crucifixion, to the Golgotha, the place of the skull. And that word in itself helps us understand and know what it is. And they press in to serve as someone who's come in for the feast. Simon of Cyrene, and he's identified as a father. The father of Alexander, the father of Rufus, which means that Mark, who's telling this story, says this man I'm talking to you about has boys, and you can talk to them. We know at least for Rufus, he becomes a believer. He's addressed in Paul's letter at the farewell greetings at the end in the 16th chapter. He refers to Rufus. And so Cyrene has this experience of pulling the cross, and it's one that brings him to understand who this Jesus is. This Lamb of God who's being slain so the death angel can pass over. And Simon has to bear the cross. He has to pick it up. He has to pull it through the streets. He has to hear all the people, all the jeers, all the mocking that goes on. And that experience draws him to Jesus in a way that nothing else could. When they get to the place of Golgotha, and we're in verse 22 now, translate that place of the skull, that place where the cross is put up onto the rock, where the holes have been dug into the rock because they have done this enough so that when those uh, poles get put up, the cross just slides into socket with a crash. They've done this lots of times, and they'll do it more. And they divide up his garments, which means when they secure him to the cross before they put him up there, they strip him, and that was normal for crucifixion. Another means of humiliation. They take his garments from him. We know from the other gospels that there's a little argument. They want to pull, they don't want to tear it, and so they cast lots. There's a lot of talk about that. They did have a game back then of chance, 12 lines, and so they draw a little diagram, and they have their what we would call die, and they roll them to see on whom the lot will fall, where it goes. It's sort of a game of roll and chance, and where they land within these little marked off boundaries of who wins and who loses. I heard a great sermon one time asking the question, are you playing a game of chance at the foot of the cross? I mean, these guys are so calloused. They've seen so much agony and torture that they're numb to it. Read the stories of people who've been foot soldiers in infantry and in hand-to-hand combat, especially the stories that come out of those World War II stories, and it so affects the men who are involved in it that they become calloused. They have a disassociation from what's going on, and these men were there. They didn't know who Jesus was, didn't care who Jesus was, barely looking at the garments, and they get himself through it. And it's in the morning. We're told the third hour, which had been about 9 o'clock. And they put a description up there, and the description isn't to be a title, but it's it's the description of the accusation against Jesus, the King of the Jews. That was the accusation. That was the great blasphemy that he had made. And there were, Mark says, two robbers with him. We don't hear the story of the two robbers, only that they join in the mocking of Jesus. We don't hear the story where one does and the other says, "What are you doing?" and comes to faith. We talk about the faith of the thief on the cross. But Mark doesn't go there, doesn't share that part of the story. He just talks about how there were those who were going by, just like a parade, entertained by the gruesomeness of this cross, wagging their heads, looking at him with derision and shame, and saying, "You said you're going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and look at you, you're on the cross. You can't do anything. You can't keep your promises." Little did they know that Jesus was going to keep his promise. They didn't understand that they were looking at the temple, Jesus's body, and how it was being destroyed, and how 3 days later he would rebuild it in the resurrected body that we would celebrate on Easter morning. They thought they were mocking. They thought there was no way Jesus could accomplish what he promised to do, and yet he was in the midst of doing exactly what he came to do. They continue to mock because they didn't understand, and that's usually the part of mocking. They don't understand. Let Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross so that we can see and believe. They didn't want to see and they didn't want to believe. Jesus had already said, hey, even if you saw someone rise from the dead, you wouldn't believe. Jesus had performed so many miraculous signs that evidence that he was the Son of God. The miracles that we marvel at, the ones we've heard through Mark, revealed through the whole of his gospel, they had the opportunity to see and behold with their own eyes and to believe, but they did not want to. There are times where our heart isn't in it, and so we don't understand even what we see, and we reject what we hear, and we are not persuaded of the very truth that could save us. Those who were crucified with him, Mark says, even they were insulting him. The 6th hour comes, 3 hours later. Now we're at noon, and darkness covers the whole land. Some people say maybe a big cloud came over the sky. Maybe it's like the clouds of doom. But we hear that this is not a natural kind of darkness in the words of Mark. There is a mourning for the death of Jesus, and the very brightness of day turns dark. It's an understanding that there's something spiritual, something more than man is taking place here. This darkness comes. And at that 9th hour, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, and he speaks in what some would say is Aramaic, some say is Hebrew, but he speaks his language that he normally talks in, Eloi, Eloi, my God, lama sabachthani. Why have you left me here alone? It's translated, we have those red letter editions, my God, why have you forsaken me? We don't always know if those words were there, because we get these soldiers who are saying, man, did you hear that? He's calling for Elijah. They hear that Eloi, Eloi, and they think he's saying Elijah, Elijah, Elas. It can be easily misunderstood, especially when you're in the state of the mind that these soldiers would have been. And so they want to see, hey, maybe something's going to happen here we haven't seen before. Maybe. Let's find out. Let's see if we can keep him around. So they run and they get a sponge and they put it on a reed. Remember that same word that we had earlier, that like a bamboo stalk, and they put the sponge on it and they bring it up to Jesus to have him take a drink of it, but he doesn't take it. He refuses it. And so there's, what is happening in here? He refuses to take those things that go on for him. And even when he takes it in here and we read through it, that first one that's offered to him is, it's covered with myrrh. And that's like, it'd be like giving somebody morphine, a narcotic, to get him through this painful agony. But Jesus doesn't want to escape the pain and the agony of it. He remembers who we are, and he remembers exactly the pain he went through. It's in full recognition of what he's doing that he comes to us with this great offering. He sacrifices himself. He suffers for us. If you're like most people, there's a part of us say, we don't want Jesus to suffer. I don't want him suffering for me. I should suffer for me. But love compels us. The love of a father is that any day I would take the punishment for my child. And that's what we see here. Jesus saying, I can't bear my children suffering. They deserve it. But I want to forgive them. I want to give them another chance. And I want to set them free from this hold of sin on their lives. And so I'm going to take the suffering for their sin. It's going to be paid in full, and then they can step away free, no longer enslaved, no longer imprisoned, and they will be set in free and free indeed to follow God, as Paul would talk to the Galatians in his letter in the 5th chapter of that letter. Jesus uh, utters his last breath. Um, and the veil in the temple is torn in two. Uh, and it says from top to bottom. There's people doing it, and they pull at the bottom, go up. And so I've always heard people talk about, this was God's act, pulling from the top and tearing to the bottom. That there's something in this unique expression of top to bottom that conveys that the separation between God and man is torn apart. And Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection does take away the barrier. And we are being able to be drawn forward into the presence of God, into the very holy of holies, not because of our righteousness, but because of Jesus is willing to let his righteousness stand in our place. When the centurion who was standing right in front of him, can you imagine the front row seat? Um, as much as I want to be a witness of things, it would be a horrendous place to be, to see the agony in him. And seeing Jesus take his last breath, he says, truly this man was the Son of God. But he comes to that understanding. Gosh, there's something here, something that makes the things that Jesus said, even what little this Roman soldier knew, to understand the gravity and the truth and the reality of this moment. But there are others around. Can you imagine a mother watching her son go through this? Mary was there. Mary Magdalene was there. Mary, the mother of James and the Les, was there, and Jose and Solomon. These women who had cared for him through the years were there to watch. Um, and they see their Lord suffer. It must have been overwhelming to them to watch Jesus die, but they are witnesses of it. He dies. There's no fainting on the cross to get up later. Jesus is dead. And these were the same ones who followed him from the time he was in Galilee. They're the ones who, mine says, minister to him. They were the ones who took care of him. They fed him. There were a lot of women who were doing that, eating it around wherever he went. It's their way of serving this one they knew to be the Savior. And it's just a heartbreaking of what's going on. And we're going to end our study at this point where Jesus is still on the cross. He's breathed his last. He has died for sin. And I'm so glad he doesn't stay there. I'm glad he's not still on the cross. And so as we close our lesson, I want you to anticipate the end of the story, the what is next. Jesus is being taken down, his burial, and our celebration of his resurrection. Because now the temple has been torn down. For 3 days, he will rebuild it again. And that's the good news of the Gospel of Mark. Can't wait just to get to the rest of the story. And I'm glad that you're joining me in this journey of learning the good news, because it's good news for you just as it's good news for me. God bless, and I'll see you next week.